The sky over the territory was a bruised purple, a roiling canvas of spite that promised violence. Caleb Sterling felt it in his bones, a familiar ache that spoke of falling barometers and the land's ancient anger. He was a silhouette against this fury, a man carved from the same hard granite as the unforgiving bluffs that flanked his claim. His world was the scent of pine and wet earth, the creak of worn leather, the lonely weight of a rifle in his hands. He was an island in a sea of grass and rock, and he had made his peace with that solitude. But the storm was different. It carried a malice that was more than meteorological, a screaming rage that clawed at the roof of his small, sturdy cabin. The creek, normally a placid vein of mountain runoff, had become a monster. It was a churning, roaring torrent of mud-brown water and stolen earth, dragging whole trees in its maw like broken bones. It was the sound of the world being unmade. Caleb stood on his porch, a mug of chicory coffee growing cold in his hand, watching the river's rampage. It was a fool's errand to be out, but the raw power of it held him captive. It was nature's one true sermon, a lesson in humility that no church could ever teach. Then he heard it. A cry, thin and high. It was almost stolen by the thunder, a needle of sound in a wall of noise. It wasn't an animal. He'd lived in the wild long enough to know the language of its pain. This was human, desperate. He scanned the torrent, his eyes narrowed against the slashing rain. He saw nothing but the chaos of the flood. Maybe it was the wind playing tricks, a phantom carried on the gale. He was about to turn back inside, to the warmth of his hearth and the quiet company of his own thoughts, when it came again, sharper this time, closer. A plea swallowed almost immediately by a deafening clap of thunder. He set the mug down on the railing. It rattled and slid, forgotten. His body moved before his mind did, a pure and unthinking instinct for decency that was the bedrock of his quiet code. He grabbed the coil of heavy rope from the peg by the door, slung it over his shoulder, and plunged off the porch into the deluge. The ground was a slick, sucking mire. The rain was cold as a burial shroud, plastering his hair to his skull and blurring the world into a wash of gray and brown. He fought his way toward the creek bank, the roar growing into a physical blow against his chest. And then he saw her. A flash of buckskin and dark, streaming hair, caught in the skeletal branches of a half-submerged cottonwood. She was small, clinging with a strength that seemed impossible, her face a pale oval against the churning fury. For a moment, she was just part of the storm's wreckage. But then her head turned, and her eyes, wide with terror, found his. That was all it took. The abstract horror became a singular, vital mission. He wasn't thinking about the odds, about the undertow that could pull a draft horse to its death. He was thinking only of the fragile life clinging to a dying tree. He tied one end of the rope around the thick trunk of a deep-rooted pine, testing the knot with a savage jerk. The other end he looped into a crude harness around his chest. He took a breath, the air thick with the smell of ozone and decay, and waded in. The shock of the cold was a physical blow, stealing his breath and driving spikes of ice into his bones. The current was a living thing, a muscular beast that tore at his legs, trying to wrench him from his footing. The mud and gravel under his boots shifted, threatening to betray him with every step. He leaned into it, his teeth gritted, his world reduced to the rope in his hands and the woman in the water. The distance was no more than 30 feet, but it might as well have been a mile. Water slammed into his chest, a relentless battery. A log, dark and slick as a serpent, spun past him, missing his head by inches. He kept his eyes locked on her. She was watching him, her grip failing. He could see the exhaustion in the slump of her shoulders, the terror in the stark white of her knuckles. He wasn't going to make it. The realization came with a cold certainty. The current was too strong. He was halfway there, and his strength was already failing, his legs numb, his lungs burning. He saw her hand slip. He saw her body lurch, caught only by a snag of her leather tunic. In that instant, Caleb abandoned caution. He let out a primal yell that was lost in the storm's throat and threw himself forward, using the last of his strength to lunge through the water, paying out the rope behind him. He crashed against the cottonwood, the impact jarring him to the bone. His hand shot out, grasping a fistful of her soaked buckskin. His fingers closed around her arm, his grip like a steel trap. Her eyes, dark and immense, locked onto his. There was no relief in them, only a strange, startling intensity. He had her, but the river was not done with them. The cottonwood groaned, its roots giving way in the saturated bank. With a great tearing sound, it began to tilt, pulling them with it toward the main channel. "Hold on!" he roared. The words ripped from his lips. He clawed for a better grip on her, pulling her against his body, shielding her from the battering of the current with his own. He was hauling on the rope now, a desperate backward scramble against the pull of the water and the weight of the tree. His muscles screamed, his vision swam with black spots, the rope bit into his flesh, raw and unforgiving. He was losing. Inch by agonizing inch, the river was winning. It was pulling them under. Then her voice, shockingly clear beside his ear, cut through the din. "The stone," she gasped, her breath hot against his cold, sheared skin. "It must not be lost." He had no idea what she meant. He was drowning in a world of mud and fury, and she was speaking in riddles. He ignored it, focusing everything he had left on the rope. One more pull. He heaved, his body a single knot of straining muscle. The bank gave way further. They were going under. Just as the water closed over his head, a final lucid thought cut through his panic. This is a damn stupid way to die. The world went black. Then, a wrenching, violent pull. He was being dragged, scraped over the gravel bed, his lungs on fire. He held on to her, his grip unbreakable even in the face of oblivion. His head broke the surface. He coughed, gagging on muddy water, his chest heaving. He was on the bank, a dozen yards downstream from where he'd gone in. The rope, taut as a bowstring, had held. He had held. He rolled onto his back, gasping for air, the rain falling on his face like 1,000 tiny hammers. She was beside him, a heap of wet leather and dark hair, her body racked with shivers. He pushed himself up, his body a symphony of pain. He scooped her into his arms. She weighed almost nothing, and began the agonizing trek back to the cabin. He didn't know her name. He didn't know where she came from. All he knew was that he had pulled her from the jaws of a monstrous river, and now she was his responsibility. He kicked the cabin door open and stumbled inside, the storm raging behind them. He laid her gently on the bearskin rug before the hearth, her body limp. He worked quickly, his movements economical despite his exhaustion. He stoked the embers in the fireplace, piling on dry wood until a hungry blaze roared to life, casting flickering shadows across the room. He stripped off his own soaked clothes, leaving them in a heap by the door, and wrapped a coarse wool blanket around his waist. Then he turned to her. He hesitated for only a second before gently, respectfully, removing her soaked tunic and leggings. Her skin was cold as marble. He wrapped her in his thickest, driest blankets, tucking them around her until she was a small cocoon by the fire. He worked with a quiet focus, his mind blessedly empty, running only on the instinct to preserve the life he had just saved. He was kneeling beside her, checking her breathing, when her eyes fluttered open. They were not the eyes of a rescued victim. They were ancient and knowing, holding a depth that unsettled him to his core. They fixed on his face, clear and unnervingly direct. He expected tears or thanks or frightened confusion. He got none of them. Her lips, chapped and pale, parted. Her voice was a dry whisper, but it filled the sudden quiet of the cabin as the storm's fury momentarily abated. "Thank you," she said, and the words were not a plea or a release, but a statement of fact. Then she added the words that would unravel his solitary life and plunge him into a world he could not have imagined. "I knew you would come. I know your name, Caleb Sterling." He recoiled as if struck. He was soaked, cold, bleeding from a dozen scrapes, and standing half naked in his own home. And this woman, This stranger he had just plucked from a suicidal flood knew his name. A cold dread, far deeper than the river's chill, washed over him. The storm outside had been a battle of elements. He had a sickening feeling that the real storm had just followed him inside. The following day, the sun rose with a kind of brutal honesty, exposing a world scoured clean. The air was crisp, the sky a piercing, cloudless blue. The violence of the storm was a memory, but its signature was everywhere. In the raw, red gashes on the hillsides, the flattened grass, and the still swollen creek, now a sluggish, muddy brown instead of a raging beast. Caleb stood on his porch, watching the steam rise from the damp earth. He hadn't slept. He'd spent the night by the fire, watching the young woman, who had introduced herself only as Ayanna, drift in and out of a feverish sleep. His mind replayed her words over and over. "I knew you would come. I know your name." How? He was a phantom out here, a man who bought his supplies twice a year in a town 60 miles south and spoke to no one. He cherished his anonymity. It was his shield, and she had pierced it without effort. His quiet life felt fragile now, a thin sheet of ice over deep, cold water. Ayanna emerged from the cabin, wrapped in one of his spare wool blankets. She looked small and frail in the harsh morning light, but her eyes held the same unsettling intelligence. She carried a small, leather-wrapped object in her hands, holding it with a reverence that made Caleb uneasy. She didn't speak, merely walked to the edge of the porch and looked out at the horizon, her gaze fixed on the distant, shimmering plains to the east. Caleb followed her gaze, his hand resting instinctively on the handle of the Bowie knife at his belt. A plume of dust was rising against the morning sky. It was too organized for buffalo, too slow for a runaway herd. It was people. A lot of them. "They are coming," Ayanna said, her voice calm. It wasn't a warning, it was an announcement. "Who's they?" Caleb asked, his own voice tight. He didn't like surprises, and a column of riders heading for his isolated homestead was the biggest surprise he'd had in a decade. "The 5 tribes," she answered, turning to face him. "They come with gifts. They come for the prophecy." Caleb stared at her. "Prophecy? Lady, I'm just a man who pulled you out of a river. I don't know anything about prophecies." "You do now," she said simply. "You are part of it." Before he could demand an explanation, the riders grew distinct. They were not a war party. They moved with a slow, deliberate grace. There were 5 distinct groups, each led by an elder. They were dressed in ceremonial attire, their horses adorned with feathers and painted symbols. It was a beautiful, formal procession, but to Caleb, it felt like an invasion. The sheer number of people encroaching on his solitude set his teeth on edge. They stopped at the edge of his property, a respectful distance from the cabin, and dismounted. One man, his hair the color of spun silver, stepped forward. He was old, his face a magnificent roadmap of wrinkles, but his posture was straight, his eyes clear and sharp. He radiated an aura of profound peace and authority. He approached the porch alone, his hands open and empty. "Caleb Sterling," the silver-haired elder said, his voice a low, resonant hum. It was not a question. "We have come." Caleb felt trapped. His home, his sanctuary, was suddenly the center of a ceremony he didn't understand. "What is this?" he demanded, his voice rougher than he intended. Ayanna stepped forward, unwrapping the object in her hands. It was a stone, flat, dark, and smooth. It was veined with lines of what looked like quartz that seemed to glow faintly even in the bright sunlight. It felt old, impossibly old. "This is the Heartstone," the elder explained, his eyes on the object. "Our histories tell of a time of great division when brother turns against brother, when the land itself will weep blood. A war is coming, Caleb Sterling. A war that will consume us all, your people and mine." He gestured to the east. "The war chief Koruk of the Red Rock people gathers the bitter tribes. He believes an old prophecy foretells the destruction of the white man. He uses it to stoke the fires of hatred that have smoldered for generations. What's that got to do with me? Caleb asked, a knot of dread tightening in his gut. Everything, the elder said. There is a second prophecy, one whispered only by the peacekeepers. It speaks of a bridge between our peoples. It says that when the river rages, as if to drown the world, a child of the tribes will be saved by a man who walks alone but carries a decent heart. That man, an outsider to our conflicts, will be the guardian of the Heartstone. He will be the one to hold it in the moment of judgment. His gaze was heavy, profound. The stone is not a weapon. It is a key, a test. In the hands of a worthy guardian, it will show the true path. In the hands of one filled with hate, it will unlock only destruction. Caleb stared from the elder to Ayanna, then to the stone. He felt the world tilting. You knew the storm was coming?" he asked her, his voice low. "The prophecy spoke of the river's rage," she said, her expression unreadable. "My mother, her mother before her, they were the keepers of this story. It was my duty to see it fulfilled." The weight of their expectation was suffocating. The 5 delegations came forward, one by one, and laid gifts at the foot of his porch. A magnificent hand-woven blanket, a pipe carved from sacred red stone, a pouch of tobacco and sage, a quiver of obsidian-tipped arrows. These were not mere presents, they were offerings. They were burdens. Each gift felt like another bar in a cage being built around him. He, Caleb Sterling, a man who wanted nothing more than to be left alone, was being anointed as some kind of messianic guardian. It was a joke, a terrifying, deadly serious joke. The honor felt like a death sentence. He wanted to scream at them to take their gifts, their stone, their prophecy, and leave. But he looked at the old man's face, at the desperate hope in the eyes of the delegates, and the words died in his throat. He was trapped not by force, but by their faith. The air itself seemed to hold its breath. The silence of the plains was absolute, a sacred pause in the unfolding of history. And then, the silence was broken. From the west, from the direction of the jagged red rock canyons, a new cloud of dust appeared on the horizon. This one was different. It was fast, chaotic, angry. It was not a procession, it was a charge. Ayanna's breath hitched. The silver-haired elder's face, once serene, became a mask of grim resignation. "Koruk," he whispered. The name hung in the air like the promise of a blade. The peaceful ceremony around Caleb's cabin was over. The stark, violent contrast of the approaching riders was a declaration. The dust cloud on the horizon was not just dust, it was the physical manifestation of the war the elder had spoken of, coming to claim the ground on which they stood. The gifts at Caleb's feet suddenly felt cheap, the honor a mockery. He was no guardian, he was just the man in the middle, and the war was coming for him. Koruk's war party was a force of nature, a visceral assault on the quiet reverence of the morning. They were not many, perhaps 30 riders, but they rode with the fury of 100. Their horses were lean and hard, their faces painted with jagged lines of black and red, symbols of old grief and fresh rage. They were the antithesis of the gift-bearers. Where the first group brought symbols of peace, this one brought the cold, hard promise of violence. At their head was Koruk. He was a man made of scars and fury, his face a testament to a life of conflict. A deep white scar ran from his hairline, across a missing eye, and down to his jaw, pulling his lip into a permanent sneer. He reined in his horse so hard it reared, its hooves pawing at the air just yards from Caleb's porch. His one good eye, black as obsidian, swept over the scene, the 5 tribes, the elder, Ayanna, and finally, Caleb. The contempt in his gaze was a physical thing. "So," Koruk's voice boomed, a gravelly sound that seemed to scrape the air raw. "The mice gather to pray for the fox's mercy." He spat on the ground. "You disgrace our ancestors with this weakness, old man." The silver-haired elder stood his ground, his calm a stark contrast to Koruk's aggression. "We seek to prevent a war that will leave only widows and orphans, Koruk. A path your father also chose before his heart was poisoned." My father was a fool who listened to whispers of peace while our lands were stolen. Kuruk roared, his hand gripping the war axe at his side. The spirits do not whisper of peace. They scream for vengeance. The prophecy is clear. The coming fire will purify the land, and the ghosts of our people will finally rest. His gaze fell on the heartstone in Ayana's hands. And you, he sneered at her, the daughter of a dreamer, peddling lies your mother choked on. You would give our sacred stone to him? He pointed a finger at Caleb, his expression one of utter disgust. An outsider, a white man. He is the fire that must be extinguished, not the one to save us from it. Caleb felt 100 pairs of eyes on him. He was the focal point of a conflict generations in the ether, the unwilling axis upon which this world was turning. He wanted nothing more than to melt into the wood of his own cabin. Before he could speak, before anyone could move, Ayana stepped forward again. Her face was pale, but set with a defiant, calculated resolve. She looked not at Kuruk, but at Caleb. Her voice was steady, but it cut him deeper than any knife. He is the one, she said, her words ringing with conviction for all to hear. Then her gaze met Caleb's, and the mask of the prophesied maiden fell away, replaced by something raw and desperate. She took another step closer, lowering her voice, so that only he could hear the devastating truth. I was not drowning by accident, Caleb Sterling. The world stopped. The roar of Kuruk, the tension of the warriors, the silent pleas of the peacekeepers. It all faded into a dull hum. The only thing Caleb could hear was her confession, replaying in his mind. Not by accident. His entire reality tilted on its axis. The brutal near-fatal rescue, his act of pure, unthinking humanity. It wasn't a moment of chance or instinct, it was a performance. She had orchestrated it. She had used his own decency as a tool, a key to unlock her prophecy. The memory of the churning water, the burning in his lungs, the feeling of his own life slipping away. It all soured into a bitter fraud. He wasn't a hero of destiny. He was a pawn. A fool who had played his part in a desperate, calculated plan. The trust he had felt, the sense of shared survival, curdled into ice in his veins. He looked at her, at this young woman who carried the weight of her people, and he saw not a victim, but a manipulator of terrifying intelligence. The realization left him hollow, adrift in a sea of confusion and betrayal. He felt used, his most fundamental self, the quiet man who helps because it's the right thing to do, exploited and twisted into a narrative he had no say in. He opened his mouth to say something, to curse her, to expose her, to tell them all to go to hell. But the words never came. A new sound intruded, a third wave breaking upon the shores of his homestead. It was the rhythmic thud of shod hooves, the jingle of bridles and sabers. From the south, along the trail he himself used, another column was approaching. Dust on the horizon, for the third time that day. But this dust was different. It was uniformed, disciplined, relentless. U.S. cavalry. They crested the small hill overlooking his cabin, a line of blue-coated soldiers, carbines held at the ready. At their head rode 2 officers. One, a man with captain's bars on his shoulders, had a weary, honorable face, his eyes taking in the impossible scene with a grim understanding. The other, a colonel, sat ramrod straight in his saddle, his face a mask of rigid authority and undisguised prejudice. Captain Morrison saw a complex standoff. Colonel Hayes saw a gathering of savages and a white man who was likely a traitor. The cavalry fanned out, creating a third side to the triangle of tension. Their carbines pointed squarely at the assembled tribes. The clearing around Caleb's small cabin became a claustrophobic, 3-way powder keg. The peaceful tribes, Kuruk's war party, and the U.S. cavalry, each a mortal enemy to the others, were now locked in a standoff with Caleb Sterling and his home at the dead center. Colonel Hayes spurred his horse forward, his voice as sharp and cold as a winter wind. Captain Morrison, you will disarm these hostiles, all of them. Morrison hesitated, his gaze sweeping over the women and elders of the 5 tribes, the fury in Kuruk's warriors, and the bewildered man on the porch. "Colonel," he began, "the situation is delicate." "Delicate?" Hayes spat the word. "It is an illegal gathering of hostiles, Captain. That man," he pointed his riding crop at Caleb, "is clearly consorting with them. Arrest him as well." The soldiers raised their rifles. Kuruk's warriors bristled, their hands tightening on their weapons, their eyes darting between the soldiers and the peace tribes. The silver-haired elder raised a hand, a gesture for calm that seemed utterly futile. Caleb was trapped, powerless. Every escape route was blocked by a different flavor of death. He was no hero, no guardian, no pawn anymore. He was simply the man in the kill zone, the unwilling heart of a conflict about to tear the world apart, stripped of all agency and facing annihilation from every direction. His act of heroism had led him here. Ayana's manipulation had led him here. History and hatred had led them all here, to his front door, ready to turn his home into a grave. The air was thick enough to choke on, a volatile mixture of fear, hatred, and the metallic tang of impending bloodshed. Colonel Hayes's order hung in the air, an executioner's sentence. Morrison's men were tense, their knuckles white on their carbines, caught between their commander's bigotry and the complex reality before them. Kuruk's warriors were coiled springs of violence, their snarled insults and muttered war cries a low growl beneath the colonel's sharp commands. The peaceful tribe stood in a silent, dignified terror, their hope for a treaty dissolving into the dust. Caleb looked from face to face, seeing only masks of certainty. The zealot's certainty, the soldier's certainty, the martyr's certainty. And in the center of it all stood Ayana, her face a canvas of desperate hope and devastating guilt, the heartstone held out toward him like an offering and an apology. His betrayal was a fresh wound, raw and bleeding. He was a fool, a tool she had picked up and used. But looking at the guns, the axes, the unblinking hatred, he realized his personal sense of betrayal was a luxury. It was a flickering candle in the face of an inferno that would consume them all. His anger at her, his confusion, his desire to be left alone, none of it mattered anymore. All that mattered was the spark, inches from the powder. Destiny is not a pre-written path, but a consequence of character. In that moment, stripped of everything, Caleb Sterling made a choice. It wasn't born of prophecy or honor. It was the last, desperate act of a man with no other moves to make. He stepped forward, off his porch, and walked toward Ayana. The movement was a shockwave through the clearing. Rifles tracked him. Warriors tensed. He ignored them all, his eyes locked on the stone. He reached out and took it from her hands. His skin touched the smooth, cool surface, and the world shattered. It was not a sound, but a feeling, a violent, instantaneous dissolution of reality. The clearing, the cabin, the faces of his enemies, they all dissolved into a blinding white light. He wasn't just seeing a vision, he was becoming it. He was flooded, inundated, drowned in a torrent of sensory experience that was not his own. He felt the future, not one future, but two, laid bare in his soul with horrifying clarity. First, the future of war. He felt the thud of a cavalry bullet tearing through Kuruk's chest, the surprised grunt, the fall from his horse. He tasted the coppery tang of blood in his own mouth. He felt the rage of Kuruk's warriors as they charged, a wave of vengeance crashing against a wall of disciplined rifle fire. He heard the screams of the peaceful elders, cut down in the crossfire. He felt the splinter of an axe in a soldier's back, the hot agony of a bayonet in a warrior's gut. The vision accelerated, a maelstrom of suffering. He was in a burning village, the smell of charred flesh and scorched earth filling his lungs. He was a starving child, weeping over the body of his mother. He was a soldier, haunted and hollowed out by the things he had done, drinking himself to death in a lonely fort. He felt the grief of generations, the land itself crying out, poisoned with blood and sorrow, a barren wasteland where nothing grew but hatred. He saw the faces of the children of the men present, Morrison's daughter, Kuruk's son, and he saw them as adults, continuing the same cycle of violence, their hearts as scarred as their fathers. The pain was absolute, a universal truth of suffering that transcended tribe or uniform. It was the future they were all choosing, the inheritance of ash they were leaving for their children. But as the last ember of that world died, a new vision rose, the future of a difficult peace. It was not easy. It was not a paradise. It was hard. He felt the sting of pride being swallowed, the bitter taste of compromise. He saw Koruk and the silver-haired elder sitting across a fire, not as friends, but as men bound by a fragile, necessary truce, their words strained and careful. He saw Captain Morrison arguing, not with a rifle, but with maps and treaties, facing down furious government agents who called him a traitor. He saw men from all sides working together to build a dam on the very creek that had almost killed him, their sweat mixing in the same soil. He saw children, their skin 100 shades of brown and white, playing together, speaking a mixture of languages, their laughter a sound that had been absent from the land for a century. He saw Caleb Sterling, not as a loner, but as a man with calloused hands from building a schoolhouse, his face lined with the exhaustion of 1,000 small negotiations. He felt the profound, aching beauty of a peace that was not given, but built, splinter by splinter, scar by scar. It was a future of back-breaking work, of constant vigilance, of forgiving the unforgivable every single day. But it was a future where children laughed. The visions were not his alone. As he held the stone, it became a conduit, a mirror reflecting not his intentions, but the truth itself. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. He projected it. Every person in the clearing was ripped from their reality and plunged into his. They saw it all. They felt it all. He watched the change on their faces, no longer seeing them as soldiers or warriors, but as individuals stripped bare before the consequences of their own hearts. He saw Koruk's sneer crumble, the scarred tissue around his blind eye wet with a tear as he witnessed the death of his own son in a pointless raid 30 years in the future. He saw the rigid certainty melt from Colonel Hayes's face, replaced by a flicker of horrified understanding as he felt the starvation of a tribe his policies would condemn. He saw Captain Morrison's shoulders slump, the weight of his orders warring with the visceral truth of the peace he could help build. He saw the young soldiers, boys barely old enough to shave, see themselves as old, broken men, haunted by the ghosts of the people they were about to kill. The connection held them all, a shared, silent, terrible truth. A fragile, brittle understanding began to dawn in the clearing. The hatred was still there. A lifetime of it couldn't be erased in a moment, but it was now dwarfed by the shared vision of its catastrophic end. The silence was absolute, holy. And into that silence, a single gunshot rang out, deafening and profane. Colonel Hayes, his face contorted in a mask of rage and denial, had drawn his sidearm. He hadn't fired at a person, but at the source of the truth he couldn't accept. The bullet struck the heartstone in Caleb's hand. There was a sharp crack, and the ancient stone exploded, not in a shower of dust, but into 1,000 glittering fragments that fell to the earth like frozen tears. The connection was broken. The visions were gone. Everyone gasped, stumbling back into their own minds, the silence of the clearing rushing back in. Hayes raised his pistol again, his face purple with fury, his eyes wild. He was aiming at Caleb this time. "Fire!" he screamed, his voice cracking. "I gave you an order, Captain. Fire on these savages. Fire on that traitor." Captain Morrison did not move. He looked at the shattered fragments of the stone glinting in the dirt. He looked at Koruk, who was staring at his own hands, as if seeing them for the first time. He looked at Caleb, who stood empty-handed and exposed, having gambled everything on a truth he couldn't prove. Then Morrison looked at his commander, at the unbending, institutionalized bigotry that would happily burn the world down rather than change its mind. He made his choice. He slowly, deliberately, lowered the muzzle of his carbine until it pointed at the ground. "No, sir," Morrison said, his voice quiet but carrying across the clearing with the force of a cannon shot. One by one, his soldiers followed his lead. The clicks of their rifles being lowered were the only sounds. It was not a mutiny of violence, but one of stillness, a profound, world-altering refusal. They stood shoulder to shoulder with their former enemies, a silent, unified front against the man who wanted to destroy them all. Colonel Hayes stood alone, his authority evaporated, his hatred rendered impotent. The greatest weapon had not been the stone itself, but the shared truth it had revealed. And in that moment of judgment, peace, however fragile, had been chosen. Months bled one into the next, and the seasons turned. The harsh sun of summer gave way to the crisp gold of autumn, and the land healed. The raw scars on the hillside softened, covered over with new grass. The creek ran clear and steady, and the world around Caleb Sterling's cabin was transformed. It was no longer a symbol of isolation, but the bustling, messy, vibrant heart of a new beginning. The sharp crack of a hammer now replaced the sound of rifle fire. The laughter of children speaking a clumsy, evolving pidgin of English, Sioux, and Cheyenne drifted on the wind. A communal longhouse built from timber cut from the surrounding hills stood where the cavalry had once aimed their guns. Its frame had been raised by soldiers and warriors working side by side, their shared sweat a more binding mortar than any treaty. The settlement, which had no official name but was simply called The Crossing, was a testament to the difficult peace. It wasn't perfect. Old tensions still sparked. Arguments over land, water, and pride were common. But they were settled with words, not weapons, in council meetings held in the Longhouse, often mediated by a weary Captain Morrison, now a civilian liaison for a territorial government that barely understood what he had wrought, or by a quiet, observant Caleb. Caleb stood before a small, waist-high cairn of rocks built near the creek bank. Embedded in its center, held together by carefully mixed clay, were the largest fragments of the shattered heartstone. It was a memorial, a reminder. The magic had not been in the object, but in the choice it had forced. Its breaking symbolized the truth they had all learned, that peace wasn't a gift from the gods to be unlocked, but a fragile thing that had to be built from the broken pieces of the world. He was no longer a loner. He was the quiet cornerstone of this community. He taught the children how to track and hunt. He worked the fields. He sat in on the councils, his voice infrequent but carrying immense weight when he chose to use it. He had lost the solitude he once cherished, traded his simple, quiet life for one of chaos, responsibility, and constant draining effort. He had never felt more at home. Ayanna approached, her steps soft on the earth. She stood beside him, her gaze also on the broken stone. The seasons had changed her too. The desperate, manipulative edge was gone, replaced by a serene strength. She was a teacher now, a leader, the bridge her mother had always hoped she would be, fulfilling her legacy not through a grand, magical act, but through the daily, unglamorous work of building a community. "He is gone," she said quietly. "Colonel Hayes." They recalled him, dishonorably discharged. "Good," Caleb said. It was all that needed to be said. They stood in comfortable silence for a long moment, watching a group of children, one of them Koruk's young son, another the daughter of one of Morrison's men, chase a rabbit near the woods. The boy stumbled, and the girl, without hesitation, helped him up, and they continued their game, their laughter echoing in the clear afternoon air. "The prophecy said a guardian would hold the stone in the moment of judgment," Ayanna mused, a small, sad smile on her lips. "I thought it meant he had to be a warrior, or a holy man. I never understood. It didn't need someone strong enough to wield a weapon. It needed someone decent enough to show everyone the truth, no matter the cost to himself." She turned to him, her dark eyes clear and full of a profound, hard-earned respect. "You found your purpose, Caleb Sterling." He looked out at the settlement, at the smoke rising from a dozen different hearths, at the sight of former enemies mending a fence together. He thought of the raging river and the desperate rescue that felt like a lifetime ago. Destiny wasn't a path laid out for you. It was the path you made, one footstep at a time, guided by the quiet compass of your own character. He had not sought this. He had not wanted it. but by acting with simple compassion in a moment of crisis, without knowledge of the prophecy or the cost, he had fulfilled it all the same. He had found a home, not in a plot of land, but in the peace he had chosen to build from the splinters and scars of a broken world. "No," Caleb said softly, his gaze meeting hers. "I think I just found my way back."